I feel like the following guest needs no introduction, honestly. I was so excited to speak with Nicole, the holistic psychologist. We spoke about so many things, but I think it really boils down to how to create a relationship with your inner child and how reparenting yourself and inner child work creates new relational dynamics. This is such a complex topic. And if you guys know Nicole, which I hope you do, because most of you probably do, she breaks things down in such simple, beautiful ways. And I have to say that in this conversation, I had so many understandings about my own self and like how I operate in relationships, how narcissism in my family context has impacted how I show up in my adult relationships, what my expectations are, what my baseline is. I'm so excited for you to hear this. And it was so clear to me why she is so widely known. She's just so fascinating, so vulnerable, so real. And it's amazing that people like her exist on the planet. And I just really loved our conversation. So let's dive in. All right, welcome. I have the awesome Nicole here today. I'm so excited. So happy to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here.
So tell me about narcissism. Like, why do people struggle to use that label? And why do you think it's important if you do?
I think a label like narcissism, which is, I think, very much being applied to a lot of versions of personality. At least for me, I had a resistance to apply it to any of my past and or present, even relational experiences, because when I thought of narcissism, historically at least, I thought of more of a traditional sense of, maybe listeners have this idea come to mind when they think of someone who's narcissistic, someone who's kind of loud and makes their presence known and kind of demands the energy in a very much more obvious way. And of course, when I looked over my relational history, beginning with my parents, because I speak a lot about how those blueprints for how we learn to relate in our earliest relationships really then become the patterns that we continue to repeat. I would never have applied that label to my core caregiver, who was my mom in particular, because she didn't present in that way. And it took me really understanding more of an expanded view of what narcissism is, meaning what it can also look like, but also really understanding that, at least in my opinion and belief, we all exist, let me put it that way, on a spectrum, so to speak. So a less obvious version that I have, been parented by is the more what we now understand as a covert narcissist. They're not really out there kind of energetically, but yet their presence, their emotions, my mom in particular, governing the household by a certain look, or a removal of affection, the silent treatment when, yelling at us, my siblings didn't kind of allow us or get us in line, but kind of this managing still that was happening. So while it wasn't as direct, the foundation of what a narcissist is the same, which is this self-focused on the person, right? Where when we are in a relationship with one, we become more attuned externally to them, to shifts in their tone, their mood, their reactivity, often trying to present ourselves in a way to avoid whether it's the emotional explosion, screaming, yelling, being shamed, maybe even being abused, or the more disconnected, kind of shut down sense of disconnection. So when I understood that, I think a lot of us, again, we might have a more expanded awareness of the reality that we have perhaps been in relationship with that type of person who we kind of had to orientate to them, often modifying ourselves, adapting, showing up the way they needed us to show up to prevent whatever it was that was going to threaten that earliest connection.
Yeah. And do you think that even like not, for me, I think it was not using that term was a way of being a people pleaser in a way. Like, oh, there's no bad people like that. Like, do you think that's also part of it and why maybe it's important to use that term?
Yeah. And I saw a very similar pattern in myself where I have had a very protective habit of the moment I register that I'm upset, I'm hurt, right? Someone's doing something that is dysregulating me, outright violating me in some way, I've developed almost an instinctive habit of kind of zooming outside, far, far away from my pain that I'm experiencing, and kind of hovering above the situation. And probably not so much of a surprise that I, somewhere down in life, became a psychologist, right? I would try to explain away, right, why what I do believe to some extent is true, hurt people, right? I would focus so much on understanding or what I knew of their dynamics and their childhood and why, they don't mean what they're saying right now. They're just dysregulated and acting in a mean, hurtful way to me. And so I have seen, even up until recently, where I have used that tendency to explain away, to understand or extend someone else compassion, that I am actually not offering myself. I've created no space for the impact that it had on me, whether it was the action or the inaction of whomever it was that was involved. And I don't actually show up in care and compassion and advocacy for myself. So very much like you, I do think that some of us can use labels, explain things away. Either we're over understanding them, or some of us continue to keep ourselves stuck in understandable anger and resentment, right? If we make them the only problem and don't see maybe the role that we're playing, the role I played, I know in those dynamics was I didn't define a boundary or a limit. I didn't remove myself from an unsafe interaction. I didn't stop trying to manage you and put myself first.
Yeah. And there's like so much headiness in that. I feel like I don't know, I was just imagining us like looking and thinking and analyzing. Do you think there's a link between like losing connection to your body and being the child of one of those people?
100%, because when we are not given the attunement, the safety, when someone can't soothe our body, we once thought that children could just do that on their own, right? If left to cry long enough, they would eventually calm down. We now understand that our nervous system does not have that capacity. A child cannot soothe or calm oneself down, regardless of what caused the upset or distress, whether it's the child's hungry or wet or sleepy, or there's something that's dysfunctionally happening in the home. The child still needs someone else's calm, grounded body to calm and ground their own body. And when they don't have that, right, like I didn't, but it wasn't in a very obvious way what was absent, because what was absent in my home was emotional attunement, emotional regulation, a calm, grounded presence when life was happening around us. So I did the best thing that all of us will do, right? I adapt it by separating myself, right? Trying to understand the world through my mind, being validated to some extent, right? Because there's a field that I could go into and I could be very good at it and collect all of these letters after my name and really think I'm helping other people and helping myself. But all of the while realizing somewhere, later in life, that, wait a minute, this was all a very savvy protective pattern that has done nothing but keep me distance from the actual emotions that I've been holding in my body this whole time.
Yep. And how did you actually, like, what was the journey for you to even see that in your mother?
So it was, and again, I think this comes up for a lot of us, when we get really honest about the limitations of our very well-meaning parents, there was, for me, a lot of resistance. I struggle it's hard for me. I cannot tell the story of my childhood. I struggle to recall details, holidays. Like, I can't narrate kind of what life looked like, though I still was living, right? All of those emotions were still in my body. So before I even had language to be able to say to you and listeners like I am now, oh, my mom was not emotionally attuned, right? One might even say that she was emotionally neglectful, so to speak. Before I had this story that I've only pieced together based on how I feel and certain reactions that I continue to repeat, I had a book, and I write about this book, actually my first book, and I'm out on a, personal vacation. We're camping in the woods, and this book, and I love to read books about what I thought was my clients. And so I had a couple clients who had disconnected relationships with their mother. So I find a book called, The Emotionally Absent Mother. And I think I'm doing some further education, enriching my, field and my help of these patients, these clients who are coming in, who they struggled with that. And I was so overwhelmed with emotion by just reading the experiences that were outlined and shared in that book, that it was literally, right, this memory of everything that I did not have, even though my mom very much was well-intentioned and cared for me in a lot of ways, she wasn't emotionally able to provide me with my needs. So even as I was beginning to have language for, wow, this need did not get met in my own childhood, I still had a lot of resistance of allowing myself to sit in the grief, the anger, how I felt about not having that level of attunement. It's very and has been very difficult for me to begin to honor that truth, share it with my mother and my family and the world around me. So I think a lot of what we're kind of dancing around here is, as we become aware of the limitations of even very, very well-meaning parents, part of the journey of healing is allowing your own self space for the grief, the anger around those unmet needs, even allowing yourself to feel, upset by the reality that your parents weren't able to fully give you what you needed. It doesn't necessarily make them a bad person, but if we don't allow space for how we felt, then we're kind of doing the same gymnastics, that I was doing to begin with, which is, oh, I'm just going to fully understand why mom and dad, you couldn't meet my needs, but I'm not going to let my inner child just sit in those unmet needs and the grief and the anger that comes along with it.
Oh, so hard. And the loop is we didn't get the teaching of how to feel our emotions, and then we have to feel our emotions about these things, and it's how?
Right.
So how were you able to do that? If somebody's listening to this and they're like, wow, I have I'm resonating. I feel like my clients always say I'm resonating, but I don't feel like anything bad happened, but they can still feel it. How do they sit in that and those emotions?
And again, what we're really talking about here are kind of body-based or somatic practices. The most foundational step of creating any change, I always like to break it down into two really simple steps. And the first step is becoming aware. And when I mean that is not just maybe the beautiful awareness that you'll gain after listening to this conversation. You're like, oh yeah, I do that. I have this knowing, this insight. I see someone said this pattern and oh gosh, I do that over here. That's a beautiful part of awareness. The awareness that really builds the foundation for new action, which is that second step, making a new choice, until that choice becomes the consistent new habit, means awareness in real time, not kind of leaving this insight the second you shut your, you turn your podcast recorder off or you leave your therapist's office. It means in real time, as you're going about your day and those habits are getting ready to take you through your day, you're actually tuning into your physical experience, your physical body, because we are carrying sensations, emotions, we're having reactions to our environment and our experiences, and all of which are driving the reactions or the patterns and identities that we're then living. And it's all happening outside of our awareness. So we want to learn how to live in that state of awareness, meaning, as you go about your day, building in, either setting a couple of reminders on your phone or, putting a Post-it note, if people even use those anymore, and, somewhere where you will see it, or, building, love it. I love Post-it notes, or building this onto a habit that you already do 1 or 2 times a day and allowing those points to be your consciousness check-in, Taking a moment when that alarm goes off, when you see that Post-it note, when you're drinking your coffee, taking a moment to actually truly pay attention to how your physical body feels, and using 3 different kind of systems as a hook for our attention, as I call it, our breathing, because these are the 3 areas that will begin to change as our body gets more and more stressed. The more stressed we are, the more likely we're going to rely on those old habits. So as our breathing begins to shorten and quicken, or we find ourselves holding our breath, those are all signs that our body is under stress. Our muscles begin to clench and tense. Some of you might even be noticing that you have particular areas where you're always clenching your jaw, or your shoulders are always up to your ears, That's the signs that your body is under stress. And then as our energy, our tension increases, our breath begins to quicken, our heart rate will then begin to elevate. So those are the 3 foundational places that we want to build that check-in habit throughout the day, so that in real time, we're present in a body who's beginning to feel the early stages of the tension and the stress that's going to cause that reaction. And now in real time, I can begin to modify how I'm showing up, I can begin to slow my movements, slow and deepen my breath, release some of the tension in my muscles, and allow myself to now respond newly to this moment instead of allowing those old reactions to take over.
Yeah, I love that. Um, I'm curious, how is your relationship now with your mother? And like said, you've spoken this to her. Like, how has that all been?
So my relationship, well, actually, June 23rd will mark the 5-year mark of having lost my mom.
Oh,
So she began, thank you, the grief of, while it is so much of my anxiety has been centered around health related issues, having very acute health crises in my home when I was in my early childhood years, and then a mother who struggled with chronic health issues and chronic pain her whole life. And also it not being lost on me that when I was born, my mom was 42 years old and my dad was 45. So I had an awareness of like my mom, her declining health, that she wouldn't be here for, as long as perhaps some of my peers would have their parents here on this earth plane. Yet in so many ways, it felt like I've been preparing for my mom's death for so much of my life, to the point where it was consuming me with anxiety for decades, that no matter how much you prepare, it still never fully prepares you for the loss of a parent. And so she was alive for her last couple years. While she was alive, let me put it that way, I was publicly sharing and speaking in this way that I am now. So she had, and we had as a family, a lot of difficult conversations, many of which were inspired by my initial decision to step away from relationships with my family, to go no contact, so to speak, for around 18 months. After I'd seen all of the just enmeshment and lack of boundaries, and taking full responsibility that I was struggling at that time in my life to create the space I needed to discover who I was outside of my relationships with them, or anyone really for that matter. And so after that really difficult and probably the hardest decision of my life, especially because my mom was getting up there in age and I wasn't sure, how physically well she would be or for how long, though that 18 months was such a gift for me to begin some of the deeper healing work. Always my intention was to reconnect with my family. We had a lot of difficult conversations in those few kind of connective moments beyond my initial break. We had therapy as a family, and we're able to unpack and begin to rebuild a lot of the cycles that we had been repeating. Though the last couple years of her life, cognitively, she was very declined. And so I think her relationship with what I was doing publicly was much more limited than my father, he's going to be 89 years old, believe it or not, in June. And so he is incredibly supportive of all of my work, and it has just inspired a lot of cycle breaking in my own family, and a lot of really honest conversations that not only have benefited my family relationships, of course, but, skills and tools that I take now with me into all of my relationships.
Wow, that's incredible. I'm estranged from my father myself, and there's so much grief in that.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's very different. I think it's very different grief.
Yeah.
Can you share a bit more about that? Because as you know, it's like so controversial. Like some people will say do it, and some people say you should never ever do it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I appreciate, and thank you for sharing your own experience. And I don't think it's ever a decision that comes lightly. I know for me, it was one that I labored over for a very long time. I had tried every which way to show up differently, without having to fully, or feeling like I had to fully, remove myself from contact. And really when it felt like it was the last and only choice I had to even try to allow a better relationship, a healthier version, let me put it that way, on the other side of it. It took me really feeling backed into that corner to be able to do that. And though you're right, and thank you, Marina, for giving words to it. It's a grief. Whether or not you're choosing to be out of contact with a parent is maybe choosing to be out of contact, or their lifestyle does not allow themselves to afford themselves a position in your life, or whatever it is. Even if the human, right, vessel is still alive somewhere on this planet, maybe it's in the next neighborhood, or, across the world, it still lands as us, for humans, as a loss, and is experienced as grief, even to some extent quite a complicated one, right? Because here is a person who is here and available, right, so to speak, to shift or change or better the relationship, and for whatever reason that isn't the choice that is the healthiest for the individual at that time. So it lands and just layers a complicated layer. But kind of even back what you are so wisely sharing, while I will share my journey of, again, the decision to go no contact, the rebuilding we've done on the other side of it, the repair, the reconnection, right? So hopefully to inspire someone with the possibility that, of what could happen. But it is never by any means to demand or to, to even to try to indicate that that's the only pathway to shifting and changing relationships, because it's not. And it's not the journey for everyone. So with all of my work, I think I tend to be frustrating to some extent, because I'm never going to give a universal model, protocol, a one size fits all, and even a determinist yes or no to whether or not you should estrange from anyone in your life. My hope is more to empower you with the tools, the inner knowing, to be able to reconnect to your own limits and decisions so that you can then inspire new actions, because relationships absolutely can change with people that are physically alive, emotionally alive, present or not, right? I think there's a whole other world of healing that then happens when the person is not physically here anymore. That is something I'm, continuing to figure out, my relationship with my mom, and right, how do I heal that wound now of a person who's not physically here to fully repair. And so whatever the loss is, again, if it's the absence of the person in relationship, then it is still a loss. And we still need to give ourselves the time and space to be with our grief around that loss, regardless of what people around us think we should be doing or shouldn't be doing.
Yeah, totally. So you're saying that you became estranged with the goal of then reconnecting? Like how was that process like? And then also, how did it affect your other relationships in your life?
So when I went into, I knew I could not continue to operate in relation with them, or anyone for that matter, without rediscovering myself, the boundaries, the limits that I needed, and learning how to show up more honestly as me, right? Sharing my perspective, my wants and my needs within relation. So when I decided to, let them know that I would be going no contact, it was with the hope that, right, on the other side of it, with me doing my work, perhaps with them being inspired into exploring these patterns, which didn't begin with me, of course. They kind of were pervasive in the whole family unit, which they did. I was very proud when I reconnected and they had gone into their own family therapy experience to explore my estrangement and the dynamics that, contributed to it, et cetera. But yeah, there was always that kind of unspoken, indirect. I probably even worded it, to be honest, because I did not trust myself to communicate with them directly, because I thought I would immediately start to feel bad and allow their upset to derail the plan that I knew I needed, which was to take that time and space. I spent a lot of time laboring over, right, a letter that I would then email to them so that I could have some time to gather my thoughts, share with them what it is that I wanted them to know, things that I had not been able to speak to them in truth about what my experience was in the family and had been up until that point. And I think I actually did express a little bit of that hope that this wasn't going to be a permanent. And again, someone listening, maybe the decision is that this person will remain, or these relationships remain unsafe. And there never is that intention to reconnect on the other side, though. Because that wasn't my lived experience, there was definitely a hope, I believe even a spoken one, that this isn't, my intention at least wasn't for it to be permanent, unless of course I discovered something in my own journey, or maybe I saw that they fully weren't open and interested to allowing my perspective to be integrated into the new family normal. But thankfully they were. I did my work, and now I did have that opportunity.
Wow, that's so beautiful. I keep thinking, at one point you said about this fixer role, right? Like when we stay in that relationship, the only thing we know how to do, or like the trauma response we go into, is like, let's fix these people. And so was that really the motivation? Like, I'm in a distance so I don't fix.
Yeah. And I think I had a lot of that internal desire, right, to make things better, to relieve the stress, to either be there practically to, help take mom or dad to the disappointment or that, because there were many, or emotionally. And also I remember, it's funny you ask this, because so I have a sister who's 15 years older than me, though she was always in the home. And so her and I had, for the first part of my life, what felt like a very weird parental type relationship, even though she was my sister. I remember well through my teenage years, I would always be like, you're being more like a mom than a sister. Stop it. And then I can't remember, because it happened just slowly. But I remember somewhere I was like entering my mid to late 20s, where I started to have this new reorganized sense of, wait a minute, it's not like I'm the younger sibling anymore and she's mothering me, nor is it that we're like peers now, right? Because to some extent, developmentally, I somewhat caught up. She was somewhere in her 30s. I was somewhere in my 20s developmentally, right? You can relate a little more. What I was sensing was it became more of an emotional reliance that was starting to now come my way. And perhaps some of it, which I do believe was probably because by that point I was the self-designated doctor in the house, self-proclaimed studying psychology and in the program to do it, right? So I think naturally maybe they, were coming to me because I was the person who was going to solve the problems, or if it was a little bit of this unspoken, more codependent type emotional dynamic. Again, not the obvious, but the like kind of tending to someone else's emotions through the more indirect messaging. But I remember it was my 20s would be the time period where I was like, wait a minute, I'm starting to feel an emotional weight coming my way, whether it was, again, about a health related issue or a more emotional thing that was happening as my mom kind of sunk into a depression around her chronic pain, et cetera. It was starting to feel heavy, that I was being looked to kind of help the family through, whether it was like practical suggestions of what we're going to do and how we're going to treat mom, or more emotional suggestions.
Yeah, wow. How do people even realize? I mean, man, it took me forever to see the narcissists in my life. How can people see that? Because it's so invisible, right? It's, as you're saying, like it's this emotional layer, and even when you try to explain to a narcissist, which you talk a lot about, they don't get it. Like they won't validate you. Be like, oh yeah, I have been doing that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I think the common markers, right, are someone who lacks the ability, right, before you even get to validating someone else's perspective, wants, needs, communication in any moment, who lacks the ability, right, to even shift focus outside of yourself, right? So someone who, right, if you're in a relationship and it's always about them, right, they never are curious, especially in a moment of conflict, right, where, and again, maybe in the acute moment where you're arguing and we're both convinced that we're right and this is how things happened and you're wrong. If and when they are, that's what I kind of was meaning earlier in terms of the spectrum. We all become self-focused when we're feeling threatened, because it's a natural evolutionarily driven function of our nervous system. Because when we're being chased by a bear on the tundra, right, we can't worry about, even if it's in our little child running next to us, right, they become, it's me or the bear, and so we kind of delete other people, even our most sacred loved ones and connections, from our experience when our body is activated in a threat driven mode, because again, it's operating solely on the survival based principle, and all that matters in that moment is me, what I'm feeling, how I get quickest to safety, right? And your perspective, my desire or ability to be a collaborative, compassionate being goes completely out the window. So again, I'm speaking to you, not if. We all have those self-focused moments. We're all sure in a moment of conflict that we are absolutely right. You are absolutely wrong. There's no other way that I could frame this or see it or experience it differently, until, of course, my body calms down. Whether it's 20 minutes later, a couple hours, depending on how big the, emotion was. For some of us, it could be a couple days, but then naturally, I think we all have those moments where we're like, oh God, right? If this would have happened now, right? It's not that big of a deal. Or like, why did I even get so upset by then? Or wow, my upset really still is there, but I didn't have to communicate it in that way. And I didn't have to say or do the things that, I did from that reactive state. So again, we all, I think, have moments like that. But what I'm talking about is a more consistent pattern, right? You're on the other side of a relationship where never, right, when the person is having a good day or a bad day, they're never able to hold someone else's perspective, right? Take any influence by hearing what someone else wants or needs, or how they experienced a moment, or what emotion they're having, and just to allow it to be, before even getting to the place of, attuning, allowing them and feeling what they're feeling without fully taking ownership of it and trying to solve the problem of it or making it wrong, right? Where you're just allowing yourself to be in the presence of their feeling, because that's a form of validation, in addition to, of course, right, acknowledging that while you might not be having that experience or agree, it might not land it that way if it happened to you, but it doesn't make how they're feeling wrong. right? So if and when the person is unable categorically across the board, consistently than not, they're never able to, right? Calm down, shift focus, see a different person's perspectives, make room for your emotions or your needs in any given moment, right? If they're always kind of stuck, and it doesn't have to, again, be the person who's making themselves known, right? Taking up all of the spotlight in a room. It could be in these more indirect, subtle ways, but there is this kind of controlling that's happening, where other people around this person just don't feel safe. You could kind of have that feeling of, oh, I'm always walking on eggshells. I'm kind of monitoring what I say or how I am around you, or I'm always trying to monitor you to avoid, again, whether it's an explosion outward or a disconnection inward. That's, I think, more typically of what we're talking about when we're talking about the kind of being more consistently, put it that way, in a narcissistic state, which makes it hard then to be collaborative, compassionate, and interested in someone else.
It's fascinating how you frame it, and I'm almost like, wow, this is so my blueprint. I like expect that, from people. It's so fascinating, and when somebody's different, I'm like, wow, you actually are listening to my feelings and thoughts and needs. Wow,
Right.
So I feel like what you're describing is just hypervigilance,
Right.
like a state of hypervigilance. So would you say that most people, if they are in relational hypervigilance, they grew up around some kind of narcissism?
Yeah, I would think that they grew up. Hypervigilance, right, is when we become attuned outwardly, usually because of some unpredictability, right? There's some shift and changes that it benefits me to be attuned to them, to you, to the environment around me. And usually, again, that's when experiences, relationships are inconsistent or unpredictable, right? Because the more I can learn the cues that shift, that predict, whether, again, is the kind of abusive explosion outward or maybe the neglectful shutdown inward, both translate the same thing to me, which is a break in safety or connection, which will then inspire a nervous system driven reaction in that moment. And so when things are unpredictable outside, right, the thing that our nervous system does is it becomes very vigilant, right? Very scanning, learning to notice as quickly as possible when that next shoe is going to drop so that you can spring into action and prevent what's on the other side of that event.
Yeah, and I really like how you shared that this is kind of a great test, like to see it when a person is calm, when their nervous system is calm, can they then take in your perspective? Not when they're like under stress, because that's really hard for me. Because I'm like, oh yeah, I see my own narcissism,
Right.
I hate feedback. It's very hard. But then when I'm calm, it's very different.
Right. Right. And that's a great marker, because when we're not calm, when we're stressed, some of us have chronically been living with, stress in our nervous system from our childhoods, an increasingly stressful environment that we're needing to navigate on the daily. Those are the moments, right, when we are reacting from stress. It's usually those age-old reactions, which is why they can tend to land a little bit, when I say this, immature, I mean developmentally, right? When we lose our words, when we are just screaming and yelling and acting ways that are so out of character, and we lose kind of the maturity because we become regressed and we become reactive to the moment in time where those reactions served us.
Yeah, totally. So what is the effect? Like, what has been the effect in your life relationally from this kind of blueprint? Like, how have your relationships looked like, and how have they kind of shifted over time with the healing?
So as long as I can remember, I think when I had my first kind of romantic partnership, I think I was around 16 years old. Well, actually, even let's start back before that. In my early adolescence, up until around high school, I really struggled socially in general. I was very, as we kind of typically know, a shy child. I would barely raise my hand, even though I knew most of the answers in school because I was doing very well. If someone, a wait staff person at a restaurant came over and asked me what I wanted to drink, I wouldn't even be able to look at the person to order. And outside of a few friends that I had that played on the same sporting teams as myself, I really struggled socially. And again, I can map this onto what was happening in the home, which was a lot of stress, lack of attunement, that to the extent that I learned, right, from that early blueprint, what I learned was people aren't predictable, right? My mom isn't able to be predictably connected to me, especially what will predict her disconnection is when I'm upset, when I'm having an emotional need. So then I applied that as the very general framework, which became people aren't predictable. They're not safe. They're not going to be there for me. So why would I ever open up to them? And I didn't. I got into high school and I could go down a whole other rabbit hole of why things changed for me then a little bit because I discovered alcohol and I smoked pot and I started to numb all of these overwhelming energies. And right, I was the city girl in a suburban high school. And so it made me a little bit different, but kind of okay. And then I went to school with all girls, all females. I didn't have to deal with any of the, kind of developmental sex gender things. So for all of those reasons, I started to have friends and find myself in relationship after relationship. Yet, inevitably, I would get to the point of a relationship where I would feel like you're not meeting my need. I don't feel close to you. I don't feel connected to you. And I would always blame the person I was dating, turning into somewhat of a serial monogamist, on to the next person who, right, would make me feel the connection that I deserve to feel. Just find the right person until, right, I kind of started to become aware of, it was when I was entering my 30s at this point, having been in all of the therapy, finally becoming aware of my nervous system and this new version of a childhood, which actually didn't have the emotional attunement that I needed, gave me now a language for why I struggled in all of those different social moments, from people just felt scary to I had to numb myself to be able to interact with people, but I'm still not authentically being myself, right? Because I've learned that bringing anything vulnerable or emotional is overwhelming to other people, and I don't want to be a burden. So, right, I'm kind of monitoring who I'm sharing what with and not really telling anyone how I'm struggling with. I'll date you until inevitably you disappoint me, and then I'll find the next person. And then I finally was seeing, wow, I'm the common denominator, right? I am bringing all of these habits and contortions, and I'm not being honest in my relationships. And I'm actually a million miles away and demanding someone feel close to me. When in the moments where I want someone to show up, right, I feel so unfamiliar and uncomfortable that it's as if I have like daggers in my hands, where I'm putting my hand up in front of me and I'm demanding you come close to me, but at what cost, right? Because I am so uncomfortable with vulnerability and with emotional connection. Why? Because I never had that in childhood, even though I desperately wanted it. So saying all that to say, I'm still very much on this journey. These habits are still wired into me. In moments where stress goes up, I am more inclined to focus on everything outside of me, right? What my partner wants and needs, a new project that I'm excited about, instead of just dropping into my body and saying, what's going on, right? Is something deeper coming to the surface? Of course, now since I lost my mom, it was just layer upon layer of new grief, new habits, new things that, right, I'm being challenged to continue to work through. So the end I will give to that very long question or answer is the journey does continue, right? I am still learning how to live with awareness, right? How to not just unpack and not necessarily maybe even understand exactly where all my habits came from, but how to now show up in a new way consistently enough over time that I continue to create habits that are better aligned for the future that I want for myself.
I love that. And I love your vulnerability right now. Like, we are not perfect. We are not healed ever. It never happens. How do you access vulnerability in very difficult moments?
It's hard for me too, because my reaction is to run away from it, right? Before I even realize I'm doing it, I'm trying to explain away or overanalyze what happened to cause the feeling, instead of just saying, it doesn't matter what happened, here's the feeling, right? Can I just sit in the discomfort before I could even, and this is kind of going back to the body's role in this, especially because we have language, right? And we have the ability to not only feel, but to communicate our emotions. Some of us put this unrealistic expectation, right? That, well, I should just be able in real time, drop it in my body, map on the sensations, know the feeling it is, the emotional language, right? And in that moment, right? Because I want to be known and vulnerable and I want you to feel close to me. So in real time, I'm going to be able to now gift you with the whole, wrapped up in language package of everything that's happening beneath the surface for me. Right. And so, right, I will be the first to acknowledge from my own journey that I don't know half the time. I will catch myself reacting, right, from an emotion where my voice starts to get louder. I start to get really emphatic and I'm sure of what's happening. And I start to try and dominate then the conversation and tell you exactly what it is or what it isn't in this moment, right? Those are markers now that I can catch myself doing that and say, hold on a minute, right? Something's feeling really big here for me. I might not have clarity on exactly what I'm feeling and where in my body and what it means yet. But what I'm getting better at doing is pausing, right, those reactions, which of course will probably increase the likelihood that I'm actually pushing someone away in that moment, and giving myself some time to, at minimum, say, hey, I'm having, like, something's coming up for me right now. I don't know what it is. I don't have the language for it yet. I might need some time to feel into it, be with my own self, right? Gain clarity, and then I can communicate it to you at a later time. So vulnerability is still very much a work in progress, because in those moments, right, the more stress I'm under, the more I'm losing my ability to stay grounded with my attention, the more confused I'm getting, where I actually lack clarity. I'm not sure exactly how I feel, let alone how to give the language to it to communicate it to you. But I've learned my markers enough and my habits that I'm learning how to hit pause and take the time, the space away, figuring out, right, how to ground my body in those moments so that I can then get to the other side with more clarity and communication.
Mhm. So is that the point of healing? Is, in your view, like, to respond instead of react, to create more intimacy and connection?
I think that's the goal of all of this, right? It's to shorten the distance between those spirals, those moments where we're lacking control or giving all of the control to someone else and feeling helpless and hopeless that I can't even do anything, right? Because the world is happening to me. It's shortening that distance from when my body is activated or is maybe living in a state of chronic activation because I've been in survival mode my whole life. And then teaching my body how to kind of go back into balance, how to push the brake after living with maybe the gas down, and then not to anticipate that there aren't moments where I spiral, I have those old reactions, right? Or I kind of slip back into old patterns, anticipating that those moments happen and making sure that I'm resourcing my body so that I shorten the distance between when I'm reacting in those old ways and responding in new ones.
I love that. What are the elements of reparenting the inner child?
So reparenting, again, to kind of piggyback off of this idea of the inner child, this part inside of us that, again, is often controlling those disproportionate overreactions or underreactions where we're not speaking up, advocating, creating the boundaries and limits that we want, and or might be creating, right, these identities of who we're being. So reparenting is, again, kind of learning how to show up in new ways, creating new habits, right? For a lot of us, because we didn't have the safety and security that we needed, those habits begin in the body, right? Noticing when our body is beginning to generate some of those signals of stress, the tension, the elevated heart rate and breathing patterns, and teaching my body how to calm down, right? Foundationally, returning to a safer and more secure physiological landscape, right? It also means, right, noticing those parts, those unseen parts, the parts that feel unworthy, and creating space for them, right? Where we don't just have to be who we've always been. We can begin to more vulnerably show more parts of ourselves than maybe we have learned has been worthy in the past.
What about, where do needs come? Needs and desires.
So needs, again, are really foundational, universal experiences that we all have. Again, beginning in childhood, we have physical needs for air, water, nutrients, rest, movement to the best of our ability. Right? This is just physiologically how the human body or a nervous system functions optimally, with those needs having been met. Emotionally, right, we all have that need for co-regulation. Again, beginning in early childhood, we can't calm ourselves, soothe ourselves on our own until our nervous system develops that ability to do that. So based on, again, these needs that universally will drive us, and then depending on the circumstances that we were born into, who was there, what abilities or inabilities our caregivers had, what resources were available to them, knowledge included in their body as well. Right now, we begin to modify ourselves, right? We begin to figure out the ways in which we have to show up to maintain whatever connections and care is available, we begin to contort ourselves, right? Show a little less of the things that result in those disconnected moments and show a little more of the things that result in someone coming up to care for us in whatever way they're willing to offer us care. And now we begin to, right, become a function of that early environment. And that we don't update our nervous system until, of course, we begin a reparenting journey where we can consciously begin new choices at a future time. But our nervous system will continue to rely on those habits, those patterns, those implicit learnings, those instinctual instincts, where it becomes over time, it just feels like who we are, that I can't even fathom showing up differently, only because I've repeated some of these patterns for so long that they feel safer, even if they come with all of the dysfunction that we want to avoid.
Yes. And in that journey, to reparent, there will be a lot of discomfort, right? How do you differentiate, like, I'm not safe versus I'm just comfortable?
Yeah. And so thank you for asking this and speaking to this, because I think logically, hopefully even, right, we anticipate or expect that, oh, well, when I commit to creating change, usually because, right, things feel intolerable, right, we're suffering in some way that we can see nothing else, but we desperately need to change this one thing or all aspects of our life. So I think logically we think, oh, well, once I start to, become more aware and do this work and create habits and patterns that better serve me, that I'll just immediately start feeling better. And that's simply not what happens for a couple different reasons. The first of which is, even back to this idea of familiarity, is what our nervous system will always prefer, even if it's not logical, right? The familiar thing that we're doing, it's creating harm. The second we step out of the zone of the familiar, we're automatically adding stress to our nervous system, because now we're in the unknown, the uncertain. We can't anticipate what it is that comes next. We spend a whole life practicing one particular outcome, and now we don't know what happens next. So stress will already then begin to build in my nervous system. In addition to the fact that when we're right back to those 2 steps of change, when we're practicing that in the moment awareness, well, how do I feel right now? Could that be determining what I'm going to do next? What a lot of us are becoming aware of is all of the discomfort that we've gotten very savvy at ignoring, at distracting ourselves from, right? So now we have the just natural stress of doing something new, compounded by, well, wait a minute, it felt so much more comfortable to focus on you or the next to-do list item, right? Something else, because now I'm sitting in the grief, the disconnection, the anger that I might be feeling based on what happened. So counterintuitively, when we begin to create change, we have to expect that it will get more uncomfortable to begin with. At the same time, we have to resource our body, right? Treat our body, make sure we're meeting those physical needs, make sure we're getting the sleep and the gentle movement in throughout our day, right? Make sure that we're eating nutrient dense foods, and to the best of our ability, maybe limiting some of the foods that we know can already stress our body out, so that we're actually building in a capacity. Because again, the more stressed we become, even with positive choices, the more likely our body will go back to those old patterns.
So important. Are there other resources? So you're kind of mentioning like the basic needs, right? What are some of the ways we can all resource ourselves in this healing journey process?
Yeah. And so outside of, right, the lifestyle choices, I can't emphasize sleep enough, because I think we live in now a society of gadgets, blue lights, so many things that either just naturally are disrupting our sleep, or because there's so much entertainment that you can put on at any times, maybe you're disrupting your own sleep. But sleep has such incredible importance for our body, for our nervous system, for our ability to have capacity the next days. And again, sleep is, I think, something that a lot of us struggle with, because in addition to creating, right, the hygiene, the bedtime, and the quietness in our sleep and our environment that, right, is conducive to sleep. You can read all of these books about how you need to set up your environment to sleep. And if your body, right, is in that hypervigilant state that we were talking about earlier, right, if all day long you've been putting that pedal to the metal and your body doesn't actually know how to push the brake, or if in childhood maybe sleep at nighttime was the time where the trauma, the stress happened, someone came into your room, there would be loud, explosive arguments, right? For me, I always worried a bump in the night meant someone was going to break into my house. Why? Because my neighbor's house was broken into. I lived in a city that wasn't always safe. Or If it wasn't someone coming in, I was afraid I was going to wake up and my mom will have passed overnight, right? So for a lot of us, we have not learned how to press that brake at night. Nighttime itself might be what's activating our stress or trauma driven response, because again, in childhood, nighttime might not have been safe. So now it doesn't matter, right? The book you read and what you do in your external environment, if you're not teaching your body how to downshift at night, right? How to maybe build in a slow movement pattern, take or a practice at night where like gentle stretching for some of us could be helpful. A bath, right? Something we can do to help our body downshift. But sleep, I can't go on and on enough about, because I think it's one of the systems that breaks down the quickest when our body is stressed, and is then what prevents us from our body from relaxing and healing, because again, we have all the trauma that we've been talking about.
Yeah, that's huge. Well, is there anything else we haven't covered? I feel like we've been visiting many topics. Is there anything else you want to share?
Nothing else that really is coming to mind, though. I think I want a takeaway, because we've been focusing a lot about just in general, right? All these adaptations, the things that don't maybe necessarily serve us. Perhaps why you're inspired to listen to a conversation like this in general, right, is because we want to change something. And I will be the first, of course. I hope my work, whether it's in the book or the social media presence, however it is that you might choose to follow along as a result of this conversation, I hope, right, it helps you create change in the areas that you're interested. Though I build to a concept in my book, and I talk about it often, which is integration, right? What's the point of all of this? Can we ever get rid of our past? And my question always, or my answer is some also version of a question back, which is, well, do you really fully want to? Right. And maybe listeners will be like, yeah, hell yes, I do. I don't want to ever have to go and suffer in this way. And right, all these ways I've adapted have only caused me harm. Yet I would imagine, let me just speak from my own lived experience. Personally speaking, I don't want to fully get rid of the drive that I developed. That was protection in childhood, right? Keeping me excelling, distracted from all of these overwhelming feelings. It made me feel some sense of worthiness when, right, I didn't have a more full, expansive state of I am worthy outside of doing. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to continue to harness that drive, to continue to create impact in the world around me. What I want to do, though, is give myself choice, right? A moment to pick projects that truly inspire me, not based on what someone else thinks or wants of me, or because it might look nice or sound nice to say I've done it, but does this inspire me? It also means that there might be moments where I choose to rest, right? Not always have to be inspired in an action. And I'm still working on this piece to allow myself to feel worthy, right? And again, that same hypervigilance that for me was developed in a home where there was always something, a family mantra happening. And right, so my attunement, which right looked like a inherent sensitivity that allowed me to be so understanding and compassionate of other people's emotions. And yeah, it's done even until recently. It's allowed me to repeat patterns that have caused a lot of harm and a lot of hurt in my life, 100%. But you're even from a point of, right, suffering, difficulty. Wow, I don't want to live that experience anymore. I will always acknowledge and affirm, I want to maintain my sensitivity, right? My ability to be what almost feels like inherently empathetic to the point where I don't want to do it at my own disservice anymore. I want to be able to draw lines in the sand and, assert myself when someone's doing something, an action or an inaction that will cause me hurt, right? I want to be able to speak up, but personally speaking, I don't want to fully lose that sensitivity, that type of attunement. It informs my work to this day. So I think that's the end I want to get to, is because obviously I will spend a lot of time with grace and compassion, allowing us to understand where some of these habits came from is the best adaptation that we could have offered ourselves in that past moment. But also I want to leave listeners with a question and just a point to explore. It might not be, right, going back to who I was before all of this started and losing the parts of myself that I have cultivated that could still have service to me in the future. And that's what my goal is to give people the awareness with the choice, right? So that they can bring with them the parts of their past that are aligned for the future that they deserve, and also break out of some of the patterns that might be overtaking or overwhelming their present.
I love that so much. It's the gift and the trauma,
right?
The shadow and the light of all of, like, the discernment of it, not just like it's bad, let's get rid of it. That's beautiful. And you have an incredible Instagram account. I always learn from you with every post, and your book and your community. So please check it out. And a podcast too, right? I mean, so many resources, and a YouTube. So we'll link all the things. Is there anything else I haven't mentioned of yours?
No, and thank you all. Thank you, Marina, for the work that you're doing. Thank you all listening. I am so inspired by each and every one of you who are quite literally interested in these conversations, beginning to take these new actions in their life. And I don't ever want it to be lost, because I do think at the end of a day, we typically review all the things that we didn't do in any given day. And, we tear ourselves down. And some of us have been practicing criticizing ourselves for a very long time. So if I'm the only person today that maybe hits pause on that automatic litany of everything you didn't do and gives you a moment to acknowledge yourself for what you have done and all of the small ways that you are showing up newly, because quite literally, again, in a time where we are on the daily met with information that isn't as inspiring as some of this might be, you are really taking actions to begin to, I think, change the experience that we're having of this world around us.